Welcome. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad. Thank you for taking the time to spend a few moments with us at Open Door. Today we're going to look at the story of a man who would not be silenced until he experienced the healing and wholeness that God had for him. We're looking at the story of a man who would not be silenced until he experienced the healing and wholeness that God had for him. Our story comes from the 10th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. We'll be looking at verses 46 through 52, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. They came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. Such a beautiful story, such a beautiful concept. There was a man who had been blind, and he was begging, but he had heard about the work that Jesus was doing, and he had a desire to be made whole. And when he heard that Jesus was passing near, he used his voice, he raised his voice, he cried out loudly and repeatedly to get Jesus' attention. What's interesting is that so many around him had just told him to be quiet. We don't know why they were telling him to be quiet. It doesn't appear in the story that they had any particularly bad will against the man. It didn't sound like they didn't want him to get healed. The story really doesn't say, but it seems to me that the people around him who had been telling him to be quiet, when they discovered that Jesus was interested in him, told him to take heart, and they helped lead him to Jesus. But before that, they were just telling the man to be silent, telling Bartimaeus to just shut up. We don't know why the crowd was trying to silence him. Maybe they didn't think anything could be done for him, that his situation, it was too severe, that he was too far gone to be helped. Maybe they didn't want him to make a fool of himself. They didn't want they didn't want him to embarrass himself, that Jesus wouldn't have time for him. Maybe his calling out embarrassed them in some way. It's really hard to know why the crowd was telling him to be quiet, why many were telling him to be quiet. But Bartimaeus would not be silenced. He kept crying out louder and louder, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." You know, healing comes in many different ways in the Gospels. In some cases, it's actually the community that helps to bring healing to the individual. I think of a passage where Jesus healed a paralytic that was carried by his friends, that was lifted up to the rooftop of a house, that they had broken through the roof and lowered the man. And the text in that passage says that when Jesus saw their faith, their collective faith, the community faith, Jesus forgave him and then healed him. Take up your mat and walk. This is a different situation. This is a case where the community was less than helpful, and in fact, they were had the man listened to the community, he would have stayed in his condition. He would have remained blind. He would not have encountered Jesus. He would not have received the healing that was available to him. So it's important to note that not everyone has a healthy community. Not everyone has a healthy community. Hopefully, when you're in a healthy community, the community can help facilitate a healing that we as individuals are not able to do on our own. Many times when we're in a healthy community, the community can empower us and equip us, and sometimes even carry us to the place where we can receive the healing, the wholeness, and the well-being that we need and that we desire. But sometimes, if we do not have the right people around us, when we don't have the right community around us, when the community isn't functioning well, when maybe it's toxic in some way, or dysfunctional in some way, or disempowering, unempowering, oppressive maybe even in some ways, when we're in that type of community, this story reminds us of how important it is to be ready, willing, and able to advocate for ourselves, to relent for ourselves, to use our voices and speak up. Bartimaeus had a desire to be made whole. Bartimaeus had a desire to regain his health and his wholeness. Bartimaeus did not want to be on the road begging for the rest of his life, blind and in need and independent. And he believed that it was possible for him to be made whole. Sometimes when we are down and out in a bad state, we have to not give in to our circumstances. We have to not give in to our circumstances. We have to believe that we can be made whole, that our life can mean something, that we can be restored more fully, that we can function in greater ways than our present circumstances dictate. And sometimes we have to block out all the negative voices. In this case, it was the negative voices of the crowd, but sometimes it's our own negative self-talk and self-thinking that we have to block out. Sometimes we have to refuse to be silent. That portion of us that desires more, that wants more, that knows that what we have right now is not good enough and is not acceptable to us. Sometimes we have to block out all those other voices and advocate. Many times people in groups that are marginalized and oppressed find themselves in these circumstances. I think of Martin Luther King and many of the folks in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. There were many people and many in the religious community that told them that their tactics were too aggressive, that their tactics promoted violence, that their tactics broke the law, that their tactics were too impatient, that they should really go about it a different way. They were told by these religious allies that we're really on your side, but we can't support the way you're going about it. In many cases, they were being told in a sense to be silent. But thankfully, many of the protesters, most famously Dr. King, but many others that walked with him, that protested with him, that organized with him, said, no, we can't wait. We can't be quiet. And they found their voice and they advocated sometimes, often against the wishes of the crowd. There were so many that would have preferred for them to be silent, to go. So one of the things that we have to be willing to do in our own individual lives and in our personal lives is that we have to be willing to boldly advocate for ourselves and to speak up, to be able to say that this situation that we have is not good enough. It's not whole. And we want to be made whole. We want to be able to see whatever it is that our need is. We have the right and the responsibility to call out and to advocate and to speak out and to ignore the voices that would shut us up. One of the things that this passage also reminds us of is that when we call out to God, God invites us into a closer, deeper relationship. When we call out to God, God will stop. It's beautiful. It's symbolized by Jesus in this passage. Jesus stopped what he was doing. Jesus was busy. He had just been to Jericho. He was leaving with a crowd, and they were going to someplace else. He had things to do, and he was a man who was on the move. Particularly in the Gospel of Mark, you see, Mark, the words are action words, and it's immediate and it's on top. But Jesus, even being this action character in many ways, a person of action in the in the Gospel of Mark still stopped everything. He stopped the procession, he stopped the crowd, he stopped everything and invited the man to come forward. And that's one of the things that's important that we can know about God, that God invites us to come forward and into a deeper relationship. When we cry out to God, God receives us and invites us into a deeper relationship, into a deeper experience. Sometimes we have a more superficial or cursory experience of God and knowledge of God. And sometimes we long for more in our hearts and spirits. As we cry out and express that desire, God does make pathways and does invite us to come closer and come into a deeper level of relationship. One thing that's interesting, that's an interesting side point for almost anyone who wants to help someone and who wants to be engaged in hands-on ministry, is notice how Jesus answered Bartimaeus. When Bartimaeus called, Jesus invited Bartimaeus to come forward. And then Jesus asked, "What do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you?" In many ways, it's a minor point, but it's a significant point in ministry. Jesus did not assume. He did not assume that he knew what Bartimaeus needed and what Bartimaeus desired. Sometimes we look at people and we look at their situations and we project ourselves, our wants, our desires, our dreams, our goals, our wishes for them, and we don't honor the needs and the desires of the individual. It could have been that the thing that Bartimaeus was most concerned with wasn't his vision or his sight. It might have been the family. It might have been a loved one. There could have been many, many reasons for Bartimaeus to call out to Jesus on that day and on that road. One of the most important things that we can do when we're working with other people in ministry is to ask people what it is that they want and what it is that they need, to allow them again to be able to advocate for themselves and not to project our desires and our wishes for them. One of the beautiful things in this passage is the way that it ends. It talks about his faith has made him well. There's many ways for healing and wholeness to come to us and to come into our lives. In some passages in the Gospels, we see that it was the faith of the community that facilitated the healing and the wholeness. Well, fortunately, sometimes in this passage, it was the faith of the individual. It was his own faith, and it was his own relentlessness, his own boisterousness, his own not being willing to be silenced or shut up. That he believed he had a vision for himself, even though he was blind. He had a vision for himself in his life, that it could be more and that it could be whole, and he would not be quiet when the opportunity came by. That he kept calling to Jesus, trusting that Jesus would hear him. In this faith made him whole. May we have such a faith that regardless of our circumstances, no longer how long we've been down, how long we've been out, no longer how we've been marginalized, or the ways that we've been marginalized, or the ways that we've endured difficulties or distress, or the ways that we are less than what we could be. May we have the type of faith that allows us to hold tenaciously to the vision of wholeness, of fullness, of the fullness of life and well-being for us. May we have the type of faith that where we refuse to be silenced, that we will not be silenced by the voices in our mind or around us that are negative, that even if our community is not supportive, even if our community is in some ways toxic, we will not be silenced by this, but we will continue to reach out to God and to speak out and to cry out until we receive the healing and the wholeness and the restoration and redemption that we need. May we have the faith that Bartimaeus has as we go through our lives. Peace be with you.